r/Nosleep. Posted by u/local redditor 1234. Hotel of Horrors. Part 1. I'm starting to think it might be better that my last ex and I never properly cut things off. Alex Xavier and I were high school sweethearts. We dated for 8 years until our marriage was legal in 2015. Our rings were engraved with each other's names. I still wear that ring despite the years. Sometimes I find myself still calling Alex Xavier my husband rather than my ex. Even so, the grief is eating me alive. I can't live like this any longer, so I'm here to share my story, and maybe, just maybe, find some sort of answer. On August 12, 2016, Alex Xavier moved in with me. At the time I lived in and owned a hotel in the middle of nowhere, Alaska. Its main audience was hikers and scientists, so let's just say it was never fully occupied. I took on the business from my father, who took it over from my grandfather. I am not sure what came of the hotel. I assume it remains vacated of human life and will rot away beneath itself until a storm blows it to ruins. Red Hand Hotel was a grand hotel. Around 300 rooms were open to the public combined with storage facilities, kitchen space, and lounges. It was single-handedly the largest hotel in the area. Alex Xavier and I lived in a separate hallway on the far west of the building. Think of a condo, a hallway packed with 3 bedrooms, a kitchen, a living room, and 2 bathrooms. In other words, it was the perfect living quarters for 2 newlyweds looking to live a quiet life. I'll never forget the first night we spent living together. From the second he set down his bags, Alex Xavier seemed on edge. I could brush this off. Alex was a very anxious, quiet man, a classic introvert, but then again, most people living in rural Alaska are. Still, I wanted Axel to feel at home in the hotel. I did my best to cheer him up, a nice dinner over wine, a trip to the hot tub, movies, etc., but nothing seemed to help. He would repeatedly pick at his hands, shuffling around with his ring, then uneasily run his fingers through his hair. Eventually, I got nervous enough to ask him if anything was wrong. His response caught me slightly off guard. No, everything is fine," he said in an almost sarcastic tone. What caught me off guard was the way he said it. Axel wasn't one to keep things from me, let alone be sarcastic. It reminded me of when we met. Alex came from a very unsupportive family. When I met him, he was a shell of who he is now. Eventually, I was able to chop the whole thing up to stress. We all get a little out of it every now and then. And I can't deny that an 80-plus-year-old hotel doesn't have certain quirks that take some time to get used to. Rattling windows, squeaky door hinges, creaky stairs. The imagination is perhaps the most dangerous part of being human, and the vast size of the hotel left our imaginations to run wild. I'll admit it myself, I never felt 100% safe living there. How could I? I was essentially living with strangers constantly. Most major companies refrain from informing their guests of all the horrors that go down in hotels, and seeing it firsthand was definitely unsettling. There was always a lingering paranoia, like when you were little and running to your bed when the lights flick off. Despite that, Alex Xavier relaxed after I said something. We spent the rest of the night watching cheesy rom-coms until we both passed out. That was how our lives went for the next 4 months, waking up, cooking breakfast together, hotel work, dinner, then gathering around the TV over beer. I'm not sure what switch flipped after those 4 months, but I suspect it has something to do with the last guest I ever took on. An elderly couple, maybe 90, that's beside the point. What I'm trying to say is these people were almost sickly of age, their bodies withering away beneath them. The wife was the one to check into the hotel. I wish I remembered her name. She was a frail old woman, with skin like paper and pearly blue eyes. Her eyes looked younger than her years, they retained a certain innocence that you don't see often among the elderly. Her husband stood behind her. I never heard him say a word. I hardly remember anything about him. Thinking back, he reminds me of the old neighbor from the first Pet Sematary movie. I found it odd that a couple of such age was so far into the country. I wish I would have seen it earlier. That night, Alex Xavier and I went about our routines. I retired early and Axel stayed up working on a painting. He was quite the artist. I still hang his works around my house, at least the pleasant ones. In truth, quite a many of his pictures were almost disturbing to look at. Not in a gory way, but on a deeper level than that, like something was fundamentally, inherently wrong with them. I hate to say it, but looking at them would make me feel sick. The one that came to mind was an oil painting, on an 18 minutes 24 seconds canvas. It depicted a deserted forest with an equally abandoned house placed to the far left of the page. I can't describe why it made me so uncomfortable. Maybe it was the murky water with hints of red disguised as reflections from the sunset, or the knife-like splinters coming from the crippled wood. I hear artists say all the time their works are an extension of themselves. I wasn't proud of fearing something that was supposedly an extension of the man I loved. Internally I justified the discomfort I felt using the same logic. It was entirely possible Axel was using his work as a way to clear his mind, an extension of his inherently wrong family life. Then again, he never talked to me about his works or their meanings, so I can never say for sure. The point is, that night we went our separate ways. With the elderly couple being the only guests, it was a quiet night. The usual window rattling and the pitter-patter of walking feet took their leave, resulting in complete silence. Around 4 o'clock in the morning, 2 unison bangs woke me. Alex was still in the spare bedroom, a room we converted into a studio. As I walked into the living room, he deliberately peered at me through the cracked door. His eyes were teared with sleep, paint covering his hands and forearms. I entered the studio trying to rub the sleep from my eyes. "Did you hear that?" I asked. He removed a headphone from his ear. I figured he hadn't heard the sound and left him to his work. After some thinking I decided it was nothing. Still, now that I was awake there was no point in venturing back to bed. I took station on my side of the studio, grabbing and strumming a guitar to no real rhythm. "Vale?" Alex sat back turned, rubbing his fingers and clenching his fists. "Yes?" It took a moment for Axel to respond, like he never really had anything to say in the first place. "Oh. Nothing." He rubbed his eyes, setting down his paintbrush. "I best call it quits." Alex stood from his station, allowing his painting to enter my range of view. This one was different. It was rare Alex painted anything other than landscapes, but this was an overly detailed painting of our wedding picture. The painting was almost identical to the photo. The details on our matching suits and my disheveled hair were exact. It appeared to me he had finished painting us. What caught my attention was a small white blemish at the bottom of our feet. It was a faint outline of a cat. I had raved for years about wanting our cat Paris to be our flower girl, as neither of our families had a little girl. Unfortunately, the plan fell through and Paris had to stay home. When I turned around to say something, Axel was gone, the door left swinging open behind him. I shrugged it off and got back to my work. Through the door I was able to see the kitchen and living room. Axel was draped over the sofa, one arm over his eyes, the other dangling over his waist. I had assumed Axel would go back to the bedroom, but now that he was in earshot I figured it best not to play while he tried to sleep. Shortly after placing my guitar back on its stand, I moved to the living room. By then Alex was completely knocked out. I picked up a blanket and draped it over him. When I did so his lips curved into a smile. I chuckled a bit. He must have not been asleep. Whatever the reason, he and I were pleased with my act of kindness. I took the seat next to him. I mindlessly scrolled through social media until around 7 o'clock when I rose to start breakfast. It being mid-December, the night season was in full effect. I always enjoyed the night season. Sure, it was harder to maintain a regular schedule of any sort when it's constantly dark outside, but something about the reclusiveness of it brought me comfort. One way or another I think a lot of people are scared of the dark. Whether or not they admit it all depends on the person, but one thing is certain, the dark allows your mind to run wild. Humans inherently fear what they don't know. I'll admit it myself. I've had a great many experiences scaring myself shitless in the dark. Through all the girly shrieks, there is always the same outcome: I'm fine after. Of course, this doesn't apply to people or animals. I'm sure I'd be traumatized for life if a stranger came from the dark and spooked me. But all of my many mythological scares caused me to grow skeptical of the paranormal. Anyhow, that day started with me making breakfast alone. I decided on pancakes. They weren't to Axel's liking, but I figured with him asleep he wouldn't eat until lunch. The layout of the house connected the living room and kitchen by a runway island. The island was connected to a system of shelves and countertops where we would cook. The living room sofas faced away from the kitchen. In a nutshell, I couldn't see Alex and Alex couldn't see me. I went about in the dark, peacefully mixing the batter and flipping my creation. At one point I turned around to grab something, a fork, or eggs, I can't remember. But when I turned, Axel was standing up from the sofa glaring at me. At first, I thought he was upset that I was making pancakes. Still, he wasn't the type of person to get mad just because he didn't like the food. I half expected him to walk over and start making another dish for himself. When I called for him he remained stationed over the couch. I called for him again, this time going to flick on the lights. The lights in our house were a variety of scattered lamps and twinkle lights. Our living quarters were constructed like the rest of the hotel, so we had only one ceiling light. The brightness seemed to snap Axel from his haze. His once stiff shoulders relaxed and his clenched fists fell to his side. I asked him if something was wrong, to which he just seemed confused. He claimed that he had no memory of ever standing up. In the past he's mentioned sleepwalking. Apparently, he did it quite often as a teen. He chalked the whole situation up to that. He did find it weird. Nothing major had changed in his life to provoke his sleepwalking to kick back up again. Still, as a precaution, we started to lock the doors differently. Alex Xavier would make his way out of the house as a teen, and it would not be good to have a 7-foot intimidating man parading around a public hotel at night. We went about our lives as normal for the next few days. Axel did have a few other sleepwalking incidents, nothing scary or dangerous. He would crawl out of bed and stumble around the house. Most of the time, he would end up at his desk in the studio. Neither of us was too concerned about the situation. We had taken the precautions to prevent Axel from accidentally leaving the house or obtaining any sharp items while asleep. Our lives went on as normal. A few more guests started staying at the hotel. A team of scientists who needed a place to stay for a few weeks and a doctor who was traveling further up north. I placed them in the same hall where the elderly couple was staying. It was much easier to cluster the guests together because you don't have to run around the whole building to clean. Plus, the elderly couple was scheduled to sign out at 11 o'clock that day. 11 o'clock rolled around, then 11:15, 11:20, 11:30, etc. At noon, we received a phone call from the scientists. They complained of a rancid smell that soured the entire room. I apologized and went up to check for plumbing issues in the rooms around them. Once I entered the hallway, I was greeted by the foulest scent. It intoxicated the whole hall, one of those smells that lingers in your clothing, and never fully goes away. It wasn't rocket science to figure out where it was coming from. The scent was strongest in front of room 33, the room the elderly couple was staying in. I cautiously knocked on the door. "Maintenance," I called out. I waited a few seconds before knocking again. "Maintenance." I twisted on the doorknob, peering in through the peephole. Looking through the peephole the wrong way distorted the room into a rounded bubble. Through the haze, I was able to make out two figures lying on the red bedspread. I wasn't nearly as alarmed as I should have been. Maybe they were just tired and forgot to set an alarm. I knocked louder this time, still glaring through the peephole. There was something next to them on the bed, two black and silver metal objects. I couldn't make out what it was at the time. It took me one more knock to realize what was going on. It hit me like a train, like a bicycle riding downhill preparing to crash. None of the hotel's sheets were red. Hotel of Horrors. Part 2. I don't remember much of that night. We had to move all of the other guests to separate rooms and the police did a full examination of room 33. Alex Xavier took over a lot of the talking. I was too shaken up to get any comprehensible words out. The police were there until night. Eventually, they sat the two of us down and explained that the couple had left a suicide note. They were tired of watching each other wither away and wanted to preserve what they had. Their solution to this was to kill each other. The police suspected they had been dead for 2 days. I did manage to tell them of the bangs we heard a couple of days prior. The police said it was most likely the gunshots. After the bodies had been removed, the police sent in a team to clean the room. They suggested that Alex and I got some rest. That we did. It was strange. That night we went about our lives as normal, huddled up on the couch watching horror movies with Paris between our feet. Despite our attempts at normalcy, there was an underlying uneasiness that ran deeper than a mediocre Stephen King movie. We crawled into bed not saying a word to each other. I hardly slept. At some point, I gave up on resting and went into the kitchen for a glass of water. I clicked on the TV, and the credit screen of the movie Cujo illuminated the room. I fiddled around with the remote before finally opening Netflix. I clicked through the channels for a bit before a feeling washed over me. Like I was being watched. I reluctantly turned to look behind. I must have jumped, or screamed, or something because as soon as I saw him, he was gone. At first, I thought he was sleepwalking again. But his eyes were wide open. Shining a deep green even in the dark. After I spotted Alex, he quickly shuffled back behind the door with unusual speed. Something in me told me not to go after him, that it was late and my eyes were playing tricks on me. The next morning, the science team checked out early. I couldn't blame them for doing so. I held off on cleaning their room. I figured I could assign it to another employee, or just hold it off. With the holiday season coming up, we wouldn't get any customers, and almost all of the employees took at least 3 days off. Alex Xavier and I were to stay at the hotel over the holiday. Neither of us were on exactly good terms with our family. Instead, I decided to clear out some of the clutter in the storage closets. It was filled to the brim with soaps, sheets, pillows, spare remotes, light bulbs, basically anything you could think of. While I was testing the hundreds of pens for dried ink, Axel walked past with a cleaning cart. "You didn't mark room 34 as being cleaned," he explained as he walked past. "I was holding it off," I responded. "Figures." When Alex spoke, the ink of my pen started bubbling from the tip. The pen rattled as the black liquid exploded all over me and the carpet. Shit. I frantically wiped my hands with the nearest cloth and dabbed the ink from the carpet. My attempts came out in failure. The ink had already sunk into the carpet and wasn't budging. I snarled more profanity under my breath once I realized there was nothing I could do. By the time I finished swatching and sorting the pens, Alex had finished cleaning room 34. He stared at me for a moment when he brought the cart back into the storage lounge. I continued, throwing out any sheets or blankets with stains on them, and threw out all of the soap with the old packaging on it. By the time I was done, the closet could fit a person perfectly inside, when prior you would have been lucky to store another blanket in there. Next on my list of things to get done was the electrical closet. It was on the right wing of the hotel and contained the documents for the electronics as well as the heating and cooling system for the lounges. It was a walk-in closet, around the size of a handicap bathroom stall, with one window and just enough space to walk between the shelves of cords and instruction manuals. I gazed at how dusty everything was and got to work. Around halfway through detangling a knot of spare wires, I noticed something around the door. Two beady green eyes peeked at me through the hinges. Uniform breathing echoed through the room as I stared back at Alex. Just the thought of that sound sends a chill down my back. I wasn't scared, more so confused. When I called his name, he slumped back around the corner without saying a word. I called for him, to no avail. Later that night, I passively mentioned it to him, and he completely blew me over. It almost made me mad how nonchalant he was, never confirming or denying if or why he did it. My anger wasn't that of burning rage, but more of confused dismay. I like to think I'm not easily scared, but I can't deny I was on edge after that. I caught Alex staring at me a few times after that. He always watched me while hidden, behind a door or hallway. He would watch me for God knows how long until I saw him. After our eyes met, he would scurry away. I started feeling more paranoid. I felt like I was always being watched. I also noticed Axel stopped coming to bed. He had always been a night owl, and frankly, I didn't care how late he was up as long as he was healthy. I was used to going off to bed alone and waking up with Alex snuggled next to me fast asleep. As the days went on, I continuously woke up alone. Axel would always be sitting at his desk hovering over his painting. Interestingly enough, he didn't appear to be working. His brushes and hands were always clean. His eyes were blank and bloodshot as he glared at his work. The only thing keeping me from thinking he had turned to stone was the stubble rising and falling from his breathing. Initially, I thought he had fallen back into a depressive episode. In the past, he had his rough spots. Still, I thought he had gotten better, yet here he was hovering over an unfinished painting day and night, neglecting his work, his relationships, his life. I tried to accommodate Alex Xavier. I took on his load of work not like he would have done it in that state and did my best to keep him company. I even managed to get him into bed at a reasonable hour a few times. But every time I would always wake up and find him in the studio. This pattern repeated for days. I would wake up alone, find Axel in the studio, send him to bed, get off to work, come home to Axel awake, and steer him to bed only to wake up alone the next morning. One brisk morning, I woke up alone, again. I walked past the studio and muttered a good morning, a habit I had picked up on. Only this time, Alex didn't answer. Normally he would mutter a morning or just groan. When I peered inside, Alex's chair sat vacated. Alarm bells went off in my head. I was so used to Axel being locked up inside I forgot about his staring. The dreadful sensation of being watched washed over me. The hair on my neck spiked and my legs itched to move away from the kitchen, to lock myself in the studio where I knew I would be alone. The primal fear and curiosity drove me mad until I hesitantly turned around. Nothing. I almost laughed. I was like a scared child watching his first horror movie. Nothing was there to watch or attack me. I was completely alone. For some people that might have been worse, but I was never given a reason to fear solitude. I continued on, going over to the fridge and retrieving a glass of water. There was work to do outside today. The gutters on the roof desperately needed cleaning, and some of the paint needed to be touched up. A storm was scheduled to hit the next day, so it needed to be tended to today. I went to retrieve my coat from the closet and stopped. That same itching primal fear took me over again. I peered through the crack in the door and instantly my previous optimism vanished. In the corner, huddled behind my jacket, shined a deep green. A thin line of light shone into the closet, illuminating his face. His eyes were peeling red. Dark circles clung to his skin and cheeks of solid bone framed his face, and worst of all, his lips curved into a devilish smile. Startled, I screamed, before exploding into a yelling fit. Alex slumped out of the closet. He brushed past me, deliberately knocking into my shoulder. He felt light, lighter than normal at least. I whipped around and watched him walk, or rather maneuver back into the studio. He was wearing a loose-fit black t-shirt. From behind the neckline of the shirt revealed his upper shoulder blades. His spine ran straight down his back in an awful bony ridge. I thought back to his face. His skin clung to his skull in a horrid manner, as if a child was tasked with stapling skin back onto somebody's bones. It saddened me. Whenever I looked at Alex, I couldn't help but picture one of those starving children's magazines. Before, he was already a frail person, but now he was truly nothing but skin and bones. I made a vow then and there that I would sit him down and figure out what was going on, something I'd refrained from doing because of his past depressive episodes. Axel never wanted me to go out of my way to help him. Of course, I still did, but Alex appreciated me simply having open arms and ears rather than physical assistance. I called out once more before I left to attend to the building, "Axel, I'm going to work on the building, come get me if you need anything. Okay? I'm worried about you," I added. Silence. "I love you, you know that, right?" Some instinct in me told me to tell him I loved him. I half-heartedly expected him to answer with an "I love you too." Even a shallow declaration would have brought me some comfort. I waited for a few seconds before closing the door. I subconsciously slammed it. I wasn't sure what was going on with Alex, but it was starting to take its toll on me as well. I bit at my lip down the halls. I was mad. Mad at myself and Alex. Mad at the elderly couple in my family. I had to unclench my fists every time I opened a door. I'll spare the details of painting and cleaning the gutters, but I'll say that simmering in my anger for a few hours didn't do me any good. When I got home, there was nothing that I wanted more than to curl into bed with Alex and pretend the word disappeared. When I pushed the front door open, it let out a god-awful squeaking sound. I grit my teeth and shakily exhaled from my nose. When I closed the door, the same ratchet sound filled the air. I stood there for a minute opening and closing the door, periodically checking the hinges. By the fourth round of squeaking, I started bitterly spewing curses at the inanimate object. I don't know how long I stayed like that, desperately trying to fix the door without tools. I must have looked like a total idiot. Nevertheless, something pulled me away from the door. I walked over to the countertop where Paris was sitting. I ran my fingers through her fur and tickled her chin. Something about her calmed me down. Only then did I detect the other noise in the room. Coming from the bathroom, I could hear the low rambling of Alex. The bathroom door was open, so I was able to see inside. He was leaning over the sink. In his reflection, I saw his unreadable expression. He looked like a hell-born devil. A smile dug into his hollow cheekbones, but his eyes were stiff and cold. His lips parted as he quietly muttered into his reflection. I couldn't make out exactly what he was saying, but it scared me. The longer he continuously jabbered at the mirror, the louder his inaudible words became. They rattled through my brain, lodging themselves permanently into my memory. I rammed my hands to my ears, desperately trying to silence the sound. Through the muffling of my hands, I did make out one phrase. "I love you." After the words sunk in, I removed my hands. I must have fallen to the ground because I had to look up to see Alex. Only now, he wasn't looking into the mirror, he was staring directly at me. I desperately stared into his eyes. Even from the distance they shined. Before I knew it, I was choking on my anxiety. The way Alex said it, I'd never heard him, or anyone, so maliciously say such tender words. This wasn't the Alex I knew. This wasn't the man I married. This was a near skeleton having a gibberish conversation with a mirror. What happened? I managed to squeeze the words out. Alex wore the same unreadable expression as he towered over me. Nothing happened. I dared not call his bluff, at least not out loud. I shook my head and tried to rise from the ground. I stumbled a few times below my wobbling legs. Not once did Alex Xavier try to help me. He returned to his station at the mirror, once again filling the air with his terrible wheezing and rambling. I took Paris into the bedroom that night and locked the door. It wasn't like Alex was sleeping anyway. What purpose did it serve to have him in the room? The snowstorm started. For the first time in a long time, I hated the snow. I stood at the window in disgust as it came piling down in large heaps. There was nothing I could do to stop it, and I despised it. I didn't get much sleep that night. The Wi-Fi and power went out, so I was left alone with my thoughts. I thought a lot about Alex. I still couldn't rationally figure out what was going on. But at that point, rationality was thrown out the window. That night, I realized that I wouldn't be able to help him. He needed a doctor, a therapist, something. I thought maybe the sight of the bodies of the elderly couple traumatized him, or threw him into some sort of long-term PTSD episode. That night I made another vow to myself, come the end of the storm I would take Alex to the hospital. The closest one is 3 hours away. I'd take Paris and we would find some inn to stay at until Axel was healthy. I tried so desperately to romanticize the situation, deep down I knew how unrealistic my plan was. Still, I tried to remain optimistic. If I was going to be stuck with Alex for the next few days, seriously contemplating what was wrong with him would only scare me. After coming up with a plan, my mind drifted to other matters. With the power out, I have to check the pipes for bursts or leaks. When the power goes out in such a rural area, it takes days for it to come back. We did have a sufficient amount of flashlights and candles, so it wasn't completely unbearable, but I wasn't exactly fond of the situation. Somehow, I managed to drift off. I awoke the next morning to Paris scratching at the door. She wasn't used to being locked in one area for long. I was hesitant to open the door. I didn't know what I would find behind the plate of wood. I hushed Paris and remained in bed until my bladder called for release. I scooped up Paris and clicked the lock, opening the bedroom door. Alex, to my relief, wasn't in the kitchen or living room. There was always the question if he was watching me, but I never felt uneasy, and Paris seemed fine. She jumped out of my arms and toddled to her food dish and started ravenously stuffing her face with kibbles. Never in a million years did I think that cat food would seem appetizing, but watching Paris eat made me realize how hungry I was. I went to the bathroom before grabbing a yogurt from the fridge. I ate it while watching Paris. Goosebumps had formed on my arms. Our section of the hotel was the coldest part of the building. Its insulation was mediocre at best, and the heating system hardly reached it. With the power out, I was unable to run the space heaters, and as a result, it was freezing. After I finished my breakfast, I rubbed my hands together and went to change into something warmer. Before I did so, I went to check the studio. As I expected, Axel was hovering over his painting, his head was down on his desk and his breathing was relaxed. I shuddered at the sight of him. Somehow he looked even more sickly. It did bring me some relief to see him rest. I silently tiptoed back to the bedroom, partly because I didn't want to wake him, partly because I was scared of him. I paced through the hotel halls holding a flashlight and a candle. I refrained from turning the flashlight on to preserve its battery life. I knew the hotel well enough to rely on the faint yellow glow from the candle. I planned to check the pipes for the major water sources first: the hot tub, the suite rooms, our apartment, and the washing machine room. Apart from my house, most of these things were on the far right of the hotel. I planned to venture there before making my way through the regular halls. It was around a 6 to 8 minute walk to the right wing. All of the wings are long halls with separate smaller halls leading to staff-only sections. The first room I checked was the washing machine room. I'll spare the process of checking the pipes. Around halfway through my process, I noticed some rustling coming from the main hall. My heart sank. I was petrified, but I can't deny that I was expecting something to happen. I was running off of an hour of sleep and panic, so my solution was to lay low until the sound stopped. Of course, this let my imagination run wild with racing thoughts of paranoia. My heart skipped a beat every time I heard it, low gargling that was always followed by grasping. Sometimes this sound was accompanied by loud thumps like somebody was running into a wall. My mind drifted back to the rambling I had witnessed. I replayed the wheezing and muttering in my mind. Eventually the sounds overlapped until my subconscious was buzzing. I clamped my hands over my ears trying to get it to stop. Tears trickled down my face as I waited. I don't know how long I sat like that, curled into a fetal position on the ground wailing like a toddler. Eventually, the sound stopped. I counted to 40 before actually removing my hands. Once I lowered them back to my sides, another sound filled the air. This one was bearable, unsettling at worst. A hushed panting that would sometimes flow into a groan. I listened for a while but was unable to pinpoint where it was coming from. I gathered my thoughts before hesitantly grabbing my flashlight. The candle had fallen at the height of my panic and sat in a puff of smoke and glass by my feet. I clicked on the flashlight and stared at the hallway before me. Around 4 feet in front of me was the curb leading to the main hall. I can't count how many times I nearly dropped the flashlight in my shaking, clammy hands. I peeked my head around the corner of the hall. My vision was engulfed in darkness and I strained to see anything. I awkwardly took a step out and peered around my shoulder before I pressed forward. The noise grew with each step I took, and with each passing second anxiety bubbled over in my chest. I refrained from holding my head high. Instead, I stared at my feet and the carpet around them. I recognized the marks of the hotel as I walked, the ink stain I had left, the patch of missing carpet, the scratched wall side. All of these things used to make the hotel feel homier, but now they left a sour taste in my mouth. I was reaching the last turn in the hall. My next steps directed me to the right, a dead end finished by another walk-in closet. My teeth clenched and my anxiety overboiled into the worst heartburn I have ever felt in my life. I continually fought up the courage to try and lift my head, but all my attempts came with failure. That is until a floor-rattling thud instinctively raised my head. I frantically spun my flashlight around the closet door. Before I could come to my senses, another thud rattled the building. It came from behind. It rang in my ears until I was forced to turn around. I dreadfully started my stroll, retracing my steps before I stood next to room 33, the familiar ink stain just inches from my foot. I lifted the flashlight into the air and peered into the room. I instantly let out a blood-curdling scream. A tall figure stood in the middle of the room glaring down at the bed. I swear its eyes were glowing. Wherever the creature looked, marks of green were left behind. Upon hearing my scream, the thing's head whipped around. I flashed the light into its eyes, dreading what I knew I would see. A nauseating sight stared back at me. His carved face was plastered into a wide dangling smile. Drool trickled down his lips and flowed down his neck. Something about seeing him like that filled me with an indescribable emotion. "What the fuck, Alex?" I yelled. "Whatever this is, I can't deal with it." I had never screamed at him like that before. I have never screamed at anybody like that before. "You know what? No, I cannot live like this anymore. Come tomorrow, you're leaving. I don't care where you go, just leave." I half expected Alex to come to his senses. I wanted him to make some rude remark towards me. I wanted him to call me a jerk and storm off. But he didn't. We stood there. I don't know what he was thinking. I don't know what I was thinking. I was staring into a monster's face with the eyes of my husband. Alex took a step, his bony legs audibly creaking as his steps quicked into long strides, chasing me down the halls. He was fast, faster than I could ever hope to be. Still, I gave my all. I hadn't the slightest clue what would happen if he caught me, but I knew it wouldn't be good. I raced down the right wing into the lobby before beelining to the west wing. Alex was on my heels. At some point he dropped onto all fours and reared behind me, nipping at my heels like a rabid dog. While in the lobby, I knocked a vase over, sending it crashing onto Alex's head. That gave me enough time to race into the nearest closet. I barricaded myself into another storage closet. I ramped a chair against the doorknob and collapsed onto the floor in a blur of sweat, tears, and vomit. It didn't take long for Alex to catch up to me. He must have pressed his face into the floor because his wheezy breathing echoed into the confined space. I stared in horror at the space between the door and the floor. Alex quickly resorted to clawing at the floor. His fingers dug underneath the door until his cuticles painted the floor red. Everything in my being told me to look away, but my eyes were glued to the scene pouring out in front of me. His nail bed squelched under the pressure, releasing indescribable sounds that was later accompanied by snapping. The concrete ground had begun to snap his nails off. One by one they lined up around the floor like a bloody ritual. The flashlight slipped from my hands. It rolled around the small area before claiming a spot behind my feet. From that angle, the light shone directly onto the door and illuminated the gruesome scene. I was shaking uncontrollably and quickly burst into long exasperated sobs. Hyperventilating while choking on my tears, I stomped on Axel's hand. I rammed my heel into the back of his palm. An audible crunch sent shivers up my leg. He seemed almost unbothered. A small grunt echoed through the crack in the door, but he continued desperately clawing to reach me. I lifted my foot once more. In between my hysterics I lost my sense of balance and slipped on the bloody floor. I crashed down, my ankle just inches from the door. Alex seized this opportunity and began clawing at my leg. His hands were cold. I let out another scream the instant they touched me. Alex Xavier was, of course, unable to actually grab me, so I easily pulled my leg away. Even so, panic ran through my bones. I lifted my heel once more and pounded it to the ground. This time he let out a cry. I stomped down at least 3 times. Each time I could hear and feel snapping bones and peeling flesh. He yanked his hands from me and seemingly stopped going after the floor. I never heard him leave, but I was also never given any sign that he stayed. So, I took my chances and waited. I counted to 800 before removing the chair. By then I had slightly calmed down, at least the hyperventilating ceased. I didn't care to grab the flashlight. Whatever was wrong with Alex wouldn't be solved by a little light. Stupid thinking, I know, but at that point, my brain had switched into survival mode. If I were to encounter him again I'd have to run. I already held a scissor from the closet in one hand. Having both my hands full could end badly. My eyes quickly adjusted to the dark. From a short glance I could tell Axel wasn't around anymore. Previously, I would have been scared he was hiding somewhere, but to my right, An ongoing streak of blood was painted on the wall. I traced my fingers along it. It was easy to tell Alex had pressed his bleeding fingers into the wall and ran them along as he walked. Essentially, I had a path leading to him. I carefully trailed behind the streak of blood. It led me back to the right wing, crossing the ink stain in room 33. The further I went, I started to notice the blood changing. In the beginning, it was a bright crimson red, but the longer I followed it slowly transitioned into a dark browny black color, and clumps of scabs and clotted blood trickled down the walls. The further I walked, the colder the hotel seemed to become. Frost bit my nose and fingers and I could feel my dose splashing sensation. The trail wended through the right wing. The trail stopped in front of the electrical closet. Its door was half open. From outside I couldn't see the inner contents of the room. I heaved in through my nose, shakily gripping the scissor in my right hand. The cold plastic clanked against my wedding ring. The harder I gripped the scissor, the tighter the ring dug into my skin. I swear it could have drawn blood. When I reached to push the door open, I felt the dull rounded edges of the ring sink into my skin. I didn't so much as flinch at the pain. I accepted the fact that whatever rested behind the door was probably going to be the last thing I ever saw. At that moment I thought a lot about my family. They're not lying when they say your life flashes before your eyes. I thought for a brief moment about my father and mother. I didn't resent them anymore. Instead, I grieved for the relationship we never had. Despite the current predicament, I thought the most about Alex Xavier. The day we met, our first date and kiss. I thought about how different we were when we first met. The trials and tribulations of life that we pushed through together. The door creaked as it opened. I was immediately met with a gush of cold wind. My eyes scanned around the familiar room. The last time I was in there was the start of this nightmare. The memory of Alex's peering around the corner of the door sent a chill down my spine. I slowly made my way around the shelves in the room. They were set up in a row of 3 facing vertically from the door. With each passing step I clenched the scissor harder. Despite the adrenaline running through my bones, there was nothing. I was almost disappointed when I came up empty-handed. I loosened my grip and let the scissor clatter onto the floor. From the far end of the room, another gust of cold air brushed through the air. With newfound confidence I walked towards the back of the room. As I suspected, the small window in the back was wide open. The light of the moon illuminated the messy windowsill. I am honestly not sure what to call the liquid staining the sill. Previously I called it blood. But this was different. Not a trace of red or that sheen that almost sparkles in the light. This stuff was pitch black. When I reached out my hand to touch it, it stuck to my hands like a sticky goop. Taking my attention off the windowsill and lifted my head to the outside. A trail of footprints led out from the window and into the wilderness. Behind them a small trail of black goop followed. This was all the answer I needed. I slammed the window closed. I stood there for a moment, staring into the woods. I knew he was out there waiting for me. After my moment of false sentimentality, I went to leave. There was no point in staying any longer. As I kicked the scissor underneath a shelf, something else caught my eye. Right in front of the door sat 2 pristine blue objects. I crouched down to get a closer look, and there, a few inches from the face, sat 2 small cat eyes. That was 7 years ago. Today I live with my sister-in-law in Minnesota. We both became friends after Alex Xavier disappeared. Originally, I was supposed to live with her for only a year or 2 to get back on my feet after selling the hotel, aka my only source of income and the only job I've ever had. But after COVID hit, we both enjoyed each other's company. I still have never told anybody what happened to Alex. The police left his case cold after the first year of searching. Anastasia, my sister-in-law, was devastated. After 2 years we decided to give Alex a funeral, partly to give ourselves some closure, partly to move on with our lives. Only 10 people attended the funeral. I was the only one to give a speech. I lied through my teeth that whole time. I know that Alex isn't dead. He's waiting for me in the woods outside of the hotel. He's waiting for me to join him. The only thing I can do is pray that he's content waiting and doesn't decide to come searching.